June 2026. NASA announced where it's going to build the first permanent human base outside of Earth. They didn't choose the safest location, not the most accessible, not the flattest terrain. They deliberately chose the most hostile place on the entire moon. Minus 240 degrees Celsius in the shadows, months at a time with no sunlight whatsoever. Dust that cuts like ground glass. And as if that weren't enough, the rocket that was supposed to carry the first piece of that base to the surface already exploded on the launch pad before it ever left the ground. NASA calls it a calculated risk and insists it's the only viable path. Are they right? We're going to the numbers. And by the end of this video, I'll tell you exactly what exploded, how bad it actually is, and the question underneath all of it. Why on earth they chose that place to begin with. Here's what this video answers. What NASA actually announced, and how the $600 million in new contracts breaks down. Why the South Pole is the only location that makes a permanent base logistically possible. What the physical reality of that terrain looks like when you stop reading the press releases, and what the explosion on the launch pad means for a program that China is chasing at exactly the same location. Stay until the end. The last piece connects everything, and it's the detail that changes what this whole race is actually about. Let's start with what was actually announced. In June 2026, NASA distributed nearly $600 million in new lunar surface contracts across 3 companies. Astrobotic received close to $300 million for 2 cargo missions, instruments and technology demonstrations delivered directly to the surface. Firefly Aerospace received $75 million to build 4 drones that will survey the South Pole from the air before any rovers attempt to land there, mapping the most promising locations before committing hardware to ground that's already destroyed vehicles. And Intuitive Machines added another delivery contract on top of its existing work in the region. Weeks before that, in May, NASA had already distributed a separate round, nearly $1 billion total to Astrolab and Lunar Outpost for lunar terrain vehicles. Vehicles an astronaut can drive, a space buggy. Blue Origin won the contract to transport them using its Blue Moon Mark I Lenin. Twitter, $234 million per delivery. All of this falls under a program NASA has been running for years. Commercial Lunar Payload Services. The idea? Instead of building everything in-house, buy the ride. And buy multiple rides at once from multiple vendors, so the program doesn't collapse if any single one fails. But here's the part of this strategy that changes the risk calculus entirely. The logic is straightforward. Instead of building every spacecraft in-house, NASA buys the ride from private companies. The same logic it used to send astronauts to the International Space Station with SpaceX, now applied to something far more ambitious, building a settlement on another world, piece by piece. There's something significant in this approach. Previously, NASA built a mission, tested it for years, and launched it once. With multiple companies and vehicles operating in parallel, the agency can absorb individual failures, because another lander, another rover, another contract is already lined up to take its place. It's a strategy that looks less like a single Apollo-style mission and more like an industrial supply chain. Total budget for the complete program, $30 billion. Final objective, permanent human presence by 2036. The first phase, the one happening now, costs roughly $10 billion and needs to be operational by 2028. For reference, this is a project more expensive than building the entire International Space Station, with one critical difference. The ISS was built to orbit. This is being built to stay on solid ground, in the most extreme environment in the accessible solar system. But the location choice is where everything either makes sense or looks insane, depending on which set of numbers you're looking at. Here's why they chose the South Pole. And this is the part the press releases actually get right. The first reason is water. Inside the permanently shadowed craters at the South Pole, places where sunlight has never reached in billions of years, scientists have long suspected that water ice is trapped, preserved by the cold that never lets it escape. Water, split by electrolysis, becomes hydrogen and oxygen. Oxygen keeps humans alive. Hydrogen and oxygen together, in liquid form, are rocket propellant. Without local water, every liter has to be shipped from Earth at a cost that multiplies everything by a factor most people don't want to calculate out loud. With local water, a base can manufacture both fuel and breathable air on site. The second reason is energy. While the crater floors sit in permanent darkness, the ridges above them receive near-continuous sunlight throughout the lunar year. That's the best solar power availability anywhere on the moon, which means you can have panels running on the ridge while the ice sits a few hundred meters away in the shadow below. The third reason is shielding. Those same deep craters act as natural shields against cosmic radiation and micrometeorite impacts, two things that would slowly destroy any surface structure built for years instead of days. On Earth, the atmosphere handles both invisibly. On the Moon, the only available shielding is the terrain itself. Water for fuel, near-constant energy, natural radiation protection. On paper, it's the ideal combination. On paper. Because that same terrain that offers all those advantages is also the most hostile place on the entire Moon. Start with temperature. Inside the permanently shadowed zones, instruments in orbit have measured temperatures as low as -240 degrees Celsius. That's not a dramatic approximation. It's a measured data point. It's colder than the surface of Pluto. At that temperature, materials that function perfectly on Earth become brittle. Lubricants freeze solid. Batteries lose capacity within minutes. Then there's the dust. Lunar dust is nothing like dust on Earth. Microscopic, sharp-edged, ground glass with an electrostatic charge. It sticks to suits, solar panels, every mechanical joint. Apollo astronauts reported it degraded seals and abraded equipment within hours, 50 years ago. It remains today one of the genuinely unsolved engineering problems of long-duration lunar presence. So unsolved that specific sensors are already being sent ahead just to study how it accumulates on surfaces. No joke. This is a material that defeated equipment designed by the most sophisticated space program in history. After a few hours of contact, the South Pole base is planned to operate for decades. Then cosmic radiation without atmospheric protection, capable of damaging both electronics and human tissue with prolonged exposure. Terrain full of rocks, steep slopes, and shifting shadows that defeat even the most advanced navigation systems, and landing precision requirements that existing vehicles haven't consistently met. And there's something almost nobody mentions: the polar night. In certain periods, darkness can last weeks or months, even in zones that are normally illuminated, because the sun's angle at the poles is so low that any small obstruction blocks it completely. When that happens, solar panels stop producing power, which is why NASA is already talking openly about radioisotope power sources and, eventually, a compact nuclear reactor, just to keep the base running through those dark stretches. A nuclear reactor on the Moon sounds like science fiction. It isn't. According to the program's own engineers, it's the only realistic way to guarantee continuous power in that environment. Extreme cold, abrasive dust, constant radiation, unpredictable terrain, weeks of darkness. NASA's own engineers have said publicly, this is probably the most difficult engineering challenge the agency has ever attempted outside Earth. Not even the Apollo missions, which landed near the lunar equator on flat terrain with consistent sunlight, faced anything close to this combination. And that's not even the hardest part, because this isn't theoretical. There's a first mission with an actual date, and it already had its first serious problem. It's called Moonbase I, the mission that opens the entire program, scheduled for the second half of 2026, with Blue Origin as the central piece. Its lander, The Blue Moon Mark I even has a name: Endurance. It's going to attempt a precision landing at the South Pole, validating exactly the technology that will need to repeat successfully over and over to deliver the terrain vehicles and heavy infrastructure in the years that follow. This isn't a small test. This is the validation of the entire system: the rocket, the lander, the precision navigation that every subsequent mission depends on. If this fails, it's not just one lost spacecraft. It's the failure of the template the entire program was planning to use going forward. Get this. In May 2026, one of Blue Origin's New Glenn rockets exploded on the launch pad. Not in flight, not after liftoff, on the ground, before it ever flew. The explosion destroyed key launch infrastructure. The reconstruction timeline is still unclear. That rocket was supposed to carry Endurance to the South Pole this year. NASA insists the 2028 timeline is intact, that alternative launch routes exist. But the central piece of the most ambitious plan in 50 years depends right now on a company that just lost its own launch pad. And Blue Origin isn't the only one with a difficult record in this specific region. Intuitive Machines has landed 2 spacecraft near the South Pole. Both times, the vehicle ended up on its side, tipped over on the surface. Functional, but not as planned. Only one company has achieved a fully successful landing in this new era of lunar exploration: Firefly, with its Blue Ghost spacecraft. But Blue Ghost landed near the equator, not in the most demanding terrain on the Moon. The region NASA chose for its permanent base is, so far, the region with the worst landing success record of the current era. And the entire strategy for Moonbase depends on breaking that streak, in the attempt with the most political and financial pressure riding on it. Turns out, NASA isn't the only one racing toward that same spot. Because while all of this is playing out, another country has been building, quietly, toward exactly the same location. China already has its own South Pole roadmap. Alongside Russia, it's planning a joint facility called the International Lunar Research Station, with over a dozen countries already signed onto the project. 2 programs, 2 superpowers, targeting the same narrow strip of frozen terrain. And this isn't a distant or aspirational plan. China has chained 4 consecutive successful lunar missions before this one: the first ever landing on the Moon's far side, 2 sample return missions that brought lunar material back to Earth for the first time in over 40 years. It's not starting from scratch. It's arriving at this competition with a nearly perfect recent record, while the US is still figuring out how to rebuild its launch pad. In August of this year, China is launching Chang'e 7, a mission specifically designed to hop into one of those permanently shadowed craters and directly confirm whether ice is actually there. Same region, same craters, same target. And the timing gap is the detail that's hardest to argue away. Chang'e 7 is aiming for a landing toward the end of 2026. Moonbase Y, the first American mission to the same region, doesn't have a confirmed date yet, precisely because of the launch pad problem. If the timelines hold as they currently stand, China could physically confirm the presence of ice with its own instrument before the first American vehicle of this new program even attempts to reach the same terrain. When China announced its mission, there was no press conference, no administrator quote, no applause. It simply built in silence until the spacecraft was ready on the pad. The United States announced the full 30-year plan before resolving its single largest near-term risk: the rocket that was supposed to carry the first piece. That's the gap that everyone in the program understands, and almost nobody says directly. Think about that for a second. The most important question in this entire program, whether the ice is actually there, in the amount needed, accessible enough to use, has never been directly confirmed. Every calculation, every contract, every dollar in that $30 billion budget is built on a resource that, as of today, no instrument has physically touched. And this is where the real estate analogy breaks down. In real estate, you can walk the property before you buy it. Here, the commitment is already made. The contracts are signed. The timelines are running. And the ground truth of whether any of it works depends on a measurement that hasn't happened yet. Think about what this represents. There are only so many locations at the South Pole that combine near-permanent sunlight on the ridges with permanently shadowed craters below. That combination is rare. The good spots are limited. The first country to establish operational infrastructure at those locations doesn't just plant a flag. It sets the terms for every arrival that comes after. Who gets access to the best energy positions? Who has first knowledge of where the ice deposits actually are? Who's already built infrastructure that everyone else will have to work around? It's not just space exploration. It's the first real estate development in another world. And if you think that analogy is dramatic, consider this. In the history of resource development on Earth, the entity that builds first on the best terrain has never had to negotiate from a position of weakness. Never. Not once. The same logic applies here, except there's no resale market, no appeal process, no second auction. If one of these programs succeeds, if a base gets built that has stable power and its own water supply, it stops being a research outpost. It becomes a fuel depot. Launching a mission to Mars from the Moon costs a fraction of what it costs from Earth, because lunar gravity is 1/6 of Earth's. The Moon, with functioning water electrolysis, becomes the first gas station in space. And here's where the timeline pressure becomes real. A staging point for the asteroid belt, for deeper exploration, for anything that requires fuel beyond Earth orbit. That staging point is only useful if you get there before the alternative does. If China establishes the first working water extraction at the South Pole, it doesn't just win a scientific prize, it owns the first logistics node in the solar system. That's the difference between visiting space and beginning to live in it. And those are two very different things for every mission that comes after. And all of it, absolutely all of it, depends on that ice being there, in the right quantity, in the right form, accessible enough to actually extract and use. Write in the comments right now, ice, if you think what's under those craters is exactly what the models predict. Or risk, if you think this whole plan is built on an assumption that's going to surprise everyone. One word, tell me in one line, why. I'll reply to every comment once the first South Pole data comes back. And if the kind of race where everything depends on a single unconfirmed resource keeps you thinking after the video ends, this channel is exactly for you. Subscribe now. Every update on Moonbase I, Chang'e 7, and whatever comes next reaches you directly. This story doesn't end until someone puts an instrument in that crater, and we find out what's actually down there. Don't miss it.